Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Rochelle Stucker, and I will be hosting today's webinar, which is entitled 2021 and Beyond, Updates to the ECCE and ECPE. I'm an assessment manager here at Michigan Language Assessment. I have two colleagues whose names you might also see on the screen as co-hosts. Renee Salter, who is an assessment developer here at Michigan Language Assessment. She and I both work very closely with ECCE and ECPE and have over the course of several years. So we are very happy to have you joining us in this discussion so we can help you understand the changes that we have made to these tests. We're also being joined by our colleague CJ Pettis from our marketing department. Some of you may have interacted with her when you have contacted our marketing department for information or have received shipments of flyers and informational pamphlets or so on. So all three of us are very excited to help you understand the changes that we have made to these tests. And we're gonna wait just another minute or so because people are continuously logging on, and then I will start my slideshow. Okay, I am actually going to turn off my camera so that your screen will have a full view of the slides. You really don't need to see me gesturing, but we will be, the three of us will be here. CJ and Renee will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. We encourage you to leave a question in the Q&A section later. I'll talk about that a bit more, but that makes it easier for us to see all of the questions and comments that you have, and they will share those with me at the end of the presentation. There were thousands of people actually registered for this webinar, so there's a chance that we probably won't get to every single question because we anticipate that there will be far more than we actually have time to answer. But I've left some other options at the end of the webinar in case there are things that you would still like to know after I have gone through all of the slides. And at Michigan Language Assessment, my colleagues and myself will do our best to make sure that we do get all of your questions answered and get you the information that we need. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and start with the slides. And I hope you find this helpful. Okay, so today's webinar will focus on updates to the ECCE and ECPE. And as you may have seen in the description of this webinar that went out with the registration link, this webinar is focused on the updates to the multiple choice sections of the test primarily. I will also briefly talk about changes to ECCE writing, which are quite minor, but we are offering another webinar next week that is going to focus on ECPE writing in its entirety. That will be on October 6th, and I'll give you more information about that at the end of this presentation. I will not be talking about ECPE writing in any detail. It really warrants its own session. Okay, so as you know, we've been working for the past couple of years now, actually, to update both of these exams. These updated exams will be offered beginning in 2021. There are still administrations of the ECCE and ECPE that will happen later this year in 2020, and those examinations will be in the existing format, the old format, the one that you are already really familiar with. So if you or any of your students are registered to take the ECCE in December, please understand that there will be no changes visible in those tests. The changes will happen in the tests that we start seeing in the spring of 2021. Now, we're really curious to know who all is here. I see that many of you have been signing in on the chat saying where you're from geographically, but we'd also like to know what your relationship to these tests is. Please look at the poll and click who you are. You may have more than one of these roles simultaneously. It's quite possible that you're the parent of a student or future test taker, but you're also a language school owner. So feel free to click all that apply. And I'll give you just a couple of minutes to fill this out, and then we'll see who is here. Looks like about 80% of people have responded so far. It looks like we have people in all of these categories, with the majority of language school teachers, which is what we expected, but also public school teachers. We did host a webinar earlier this year for publishers and people in materials development, but I'm happy to see that we still have people from that segment participating, people doing research, and even some students and future test takers themselves have decided to attend this webinar. So welcome to all of you. I hope that the information that I share is useful for people in all of these situations. We expected the largest number of people to be language school teachers. So most of it is geared with that presumption in mind. However, I think that the information that I will be sharing will be useful to all of these types of people, school owners, test administrators, parents, and so on. So thank you very much for participating in that poll and giving us a better idea of who actually is here. I also wanted to say, in the chat earlier, before we began, when people were announcing where they were from, I was so impressed to see the wide range of countries represented. Looked like people on several different continents, including someone from Cambodia, which I was surprised to see. But welcome to all of you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on, and I will talk about why we decided to update the tests. So one of the reasons is that we have been getting over the years feedback from test takers. In particular, ECPE test takers seemed to really want to have additional time to work in the writing section. They didn't feel that 30 minutes was sufficient to digest the prompt, plan a response, and then write and then correct and edit that response. And seeing that we're expecting a written response at the C1 or C2 level, at least C1, we know that C2 is the goal, but some test takers who are more aspirational and may still be at C1 in certain skills. But we understand that that requires a level of complexity that probably was maybe warranting an additional bit of time. So that is one example of something that we have taken into account, the feedback that we have gotten from people actually taking the test, and made a change accordingly based on that. Another change has been changes to the test population. So over the years, the populations for these tests have been getting younger and younger. For example, in 2009, 43% of the people taking Ecpe were 16 years of age or younger. However, in 2018, 63% of the Ecpe population was 16 and under. So as you can see, there's been a pretty big jump in people taking tests at the younger age. Of course, you know, that's probably because across the world, people are starting to learn English at a younger and younger age. So they're better prepared to take these tests at a younger age than they may have been, you know, decades ago when English instruction started at a later point in their education. We wanted to make sure that these tests continue to be accessible to the population. So we have this change in the age of the population in mind, and we are making some updates to content, topics, and so on that is more reflective of the population that is taking the test now in 2020 and 2021 and beyond. There's also been some new thinking in language assessment. I'm sure you're all familiar with the CEFR. The CEFR has been more fleshed out at the C1 and C2 levels than it used to be. So we wanted to make sure that we account for that when we look at the descriptors that we use to form the question types and the sub-skills that are covered in the passages. There also is a bit more of a focus on integrated skills testing in Ecpe because this is reflected in the descriptors and standards for that level of ability. Synthesizing information from various sources is something that people are expected to do at that level of ability. So the new writing prompts, for example, in Ecpe is one aspect of the test that reflects that change. And like I said, you could hear more about that in next week's webinar about the Ecpe writing test. And we also just wanted to make the tests a bit more consistent. It was a bit strange previously that the writing section appeared in different positions on the two tests. We wanted the ECCE and the Ecpe to, because they are taken by many people as kind of two stepping stones on the same path, we wanted them to have more continuity. So now the writing comes first in both tests. The ECCE Part 2 listening, which was the monologue section, is also now a part of Ecpe as well. And we have started providing preview time for listening sets in both tests. So that is just an example of some of the things that we have done to make the tests more consistent across the two. One other thing that we have done is we have drastically shortened the multiple choice section, some of the multiple choice sections of these tests. They really just did not need to be as long as they were. The reliability of these tests is extremely high, far above industry standards in some sections. So we really did not need so many grammar and vocabulary items, for example. So we were able to reduce that, which reduces seat time then for the test takers for those sections. This allowed us to add additional time for Ecpe writing, which I mentioned was something that test takers had been requesting. And this also allowed us to play certain parts of the listening sections twice, which was another thing that test takers and teachers had been requesting. So we were able to maintain a high level of reliability in the grammar and vocabulary sections, while freeing up time for things that it seemed that test takers wanted more time on. These tests were piloted worldwide over the past couple of years. If you are a teacher or language school owner or test center administrator, you may have even participated in one of these pilots. We piloted them in several different countries. This allowed us to see whether the changes were working as expected. We did a couple of rounds of piloting. So we gathered feedback from test centers and test takers. We looked at the data, how the different item types performed. We took all of that into account. We made some tweaks and changes and did some additional piloting after that. And then we developed new specifications based on all of this information that we received. So what are the benefits of the revised tests? As I mentioned, they should be more accessible to a younger demographic. And there is a more coherent progression between the ECCE and ECPE now, and that is largely due to more task type commonality. The tests look a bit more like each other than they did before. Of course, they're not exactly the same. That's not warranted since one is targeting B2 and one is targeting C2, but we have tried to make it a smoother path between the two of them. There's improved coverage of skills in the more fleshed out CEFR descriptors that we have to work with now. And there's greater efficiency. Like I said, we reduced items where we could. In the case of ECCE, that means less seat time. So hopefully it's a less tiring, less stressful experience for ECCE test takers. And for ECPE, the total seat time was not reduced, but that is largely because of the additional time that we've been able to provide for writing. There seems to be a lot of concern amongst stakeholders about the changes. Even though most of the changes are things that people were asking for, there seems to be a lot of worry about what has changed. So we want to really just take this opportunity to reassure you that the tests are not drastically different. So I'm going to talk about the specific changes in more detail in just a moment, but I wanted to take this chance to explain some things that will not change, okay? So there's the same number of sections. Like I said, the order of the sections, the writing in particular, has been changed in one case, but the number of sections and the skills tested remains the same. Writing, listening, grammar, close on ECPE, vocabulary, reading, and speaking, all still there. The tests are still targeting the B2 and C2 levels of the CEFR, respectively. The same level of ability is needed to pass the test. So there's a lot of fear that we're just trying to make the tests harder, but that's not really the case. Within each section, some items will be easy for most test takers, some will be difficult, and many will fall somewhere in between. Because we use item response theory, or IRT, any variations in difficulty across test forms are accounted for. So there should be a range of items of different difficulty levels in each section, and the tests from test form to test form are equated so that they are requiring the same level of ability needed to pass across a population of test takers. So therefore, if some items prove to be more difficult on a given test, then fewer correct items are necessary to gain the same score than if that same test form had more easy items. And also, the reporting scale and the certificates will not change. And of course, these are still fundamentally the same high quality, research-backed exams. The changes that we have made are less substantial than previous revisions, including the 2013 changes to the ECCE that introduced the monologues and multi-text reading units. They're not quite as comprehensive as the changes that we made to that test back in 2013. In fact, the changes to ECCE at this time are quite minimal. So with that in mind, let's jump right into the ECCE and I'll show you these minimal changes that we have made to that test. So here is an overview of the different sections of the test, how many parts there are in the section. So listening has 2 parts still, reading has 2 parts still, the number of items, and then the number of minutes that are allotted for that section. So you can see that the number of items was reduced, the number of multiple choice items, I should say, was reduced from 150 items to 110 items. Okay, so the first task, the writing task, in the past, it has always been a letter or an essay. We have kind of modernized this a bit to include an email. So we just felt like, you know, these days more people write email than letters, but still we're getting at a formal writing purpose. The scenario is still a formal scenario. You're writing to a person in a position of authority. In that sense, it hasn't changed at all. It's just now that it may be framed as an email instead of a letter that you stick in an envelope and put a stamp on. Here is an example of a prompt on the ECCE writing section now. You can see that it is no longer framed as a newspaper article, but the gist of the prompt is still the same as what it would have been had we framed this as a, quote, City Times newspaper article. We're not using that format anymore, but it's still the same sort of question, problem, scenario. It's just shorter and more to the point. It still gives you all the elements that you need in a prompt, the topic, the genre, the purpose, the audience, and now you may write an email to explain your opinion. Or there is also an essay option where you're just given a statement and then are told to write an essay on whether you agree or disagree or what is the advantage or disadvantage or so on. And then, as usual, include specific reasons and details to support your opinion. So it looks different, but it's very similar to what it was before. The rating scale that we use to mark the responses is still the same. It has not changed. We're still looking for the same criteria in the responses. It's just really a visual difference. The newspaper article being gone and the option of an email. Okay, the listening section of the ECCE. We still have 2 parts, the listening picture section and the monologue section. Part 1 used to have 30 picture listening items, and we have been able to reduce that to 25. It's still played once. Part 2. Part 2 is now double played. So this is something that we have been hearing for years, that there's really a demand to hear the talk twice. So we have decided to play it twice. We have also standardized the number of questions that appear with each talk. In the past, it could have been 4, 5, or 6 questions with each talk. That is now standardized with 5 questions accompanying each talk. There is still preview time at the beginning of each set for test takers to look at the questions before they hear the talk. There are still 4 different talks from a variety of domains. The same sub-skills are tested. You could have local detail questions, you could have main idea questions, so on. And it may still contain replay items. Those are the items that appear at the end, and if they appear at all, they're not necessarily in each talk, but some of them will have them. And they're the ones where a short snippet of the talk is played again, and then the narrator says, you know, what did the man mean when he said da 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 da. So those are still included in the listening part 2 section. This is the GBR section. Order still the same, task type still the same. Used to contain 100 total items, and that has been reduced to 65 items and 75 minutes to complete the section. The item types themselves have not changed, but you'll see that there's a very drastic reduction in the number of discrete grammar and vocabulary items. 35 to 15 is a big difference. The items themselves have not changed though. We're still testing the same level. The grammatical features that may appear in Ecce grammar items are still the same. The specifications for the development of these items are identical. They're not changing at all. We just really reduced the length of the section. The same goes for vocabulary. Greatly reduced, 35 to 14. But again, the specifications have not changed. These are still the same level. These are words that we expect to be comprehensible to a B2 level user of English. There's still the same parts of speech that we have always tested. We just really hope that these reductions will reduce test taker fatigue in these sections. It used to go on for several pages, the grammar and vocabulary items, much quicker to work through now. Reading part 1. These are the reading passages that are accompanied by the reading comprehension questions. So there are still 2 passages and they are still the same length. The specifications have not changed. The only change in this section is that each reading comprehension passage will now be accompanied by 6 questions instead of 5. Previously, they each had 5. Now they will have 6. But they will still target the same sub-skills. This will just give us broader coverage within each set. Because before, where a certain set may not have had a vocabulary item or may not have had a referent item or a detail item, with 6 questions accompanying the set instead of 5, we can test a broader range of those sub-skills in any given set. Reading part 2, same. You will still see 4 thematically related passages with graphics in each set. We are now going to have 12 questions accompanying each set instead of the previous 10. So the tasks themselves are unchanged. You just may see a broader distribution of questions focusing on different reading sub-skills because we have more items appearing with the section. Now, it may interest you to note that we have always developed the reading part 1 with 8 items and the reading part 2 with 15 items. It's just that we don't use all of the items that we develop. This will just allow us to include more of the items that we have always been developing with these sets with them in the test booklet. There is no change for the speaking section of the Ecce, so don't really have anything to say about that. Okay, and again, just an overview of what the breakdown of the new test will be. Other than the slight revision to the writing, all tasks are the same. The changes are to the number of items and the listening talks being played twice in part 2 of the listening section. Okay, let's move on then to the Ecpe. With this test, we did increase the total amount of seat time by 5 minutes. Again, that's mostly due to the 15-minute increase in the writing section, and also too because we are doing double play audio for listening part 3. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay, changes to the Ecpe writing section are the topic of next week's webinar, so I'm not really going to go into any detail in it today. I will say though that test takers will have the chance to respond to 1 from 2 choices. The time has been increased to 45 minutes, and the format will provide some graphics and some straightforward sources, but my colleague Sharon Pierce will go into great detail about this next week on the 6th, so we hope that you are able to tune in then or register for the webinar so that you will be able to get the recording of it after it is finished if you are unable to attend in real time. Okay, listening section. The total number of listening items has not changed. There are still 50 items in the Ecpe listening section. However, the seat time is now longer, but that is largely due to part 3 being played twice. So let's look at each part in more depth. Listening part 1 is a new task. It is not that dissimilar from the previous conversation on the Ecpe listening, but it does look quite different in the test booklet. It's still a short dialogue, usually between 2 speakers. In some cases now, test takers may hear 3 speakers in this short conversation. The conversations will still appear in 4 different domains. They could be public, personal, educational, or occupational domains. But now there are stems, there are questions that follow the conversation. These are printed in the test booklet, and they are also part of the audio recording that the test takers will hear. There's a variety of local, global, and inferential sub-skills tested. So it could be a main idea question, for example, something about how a speaker feels. It could be something targeting a vocabulary term or idiom that was used in the conversation. It could be a variety of things. Each of these conversations is played once, and let's look at a sample of one of these. Here's the dialogue that was actually used in one of the pilot tests in this section of the listening test. I'll give you just a moment to read the dialogue. Now, as you can see, the question and options at the bottom of the page, this is what will appear in the test booklet. The dialogue on top, of course, will not. It's something that the test takers will only hear. Then, after they hear the conversation, they will hear, why does the woman mention her job? And they will see these 4 options. Previously, the conversations in Ecpe only had 3 different options. Now they will have 4. Previously, the conversations did not have the question printed in the test booklet or even read. They were just supposed to read the 3 options and choose the one that best summarized or was correct based on what they had heard. But now there is an explicit question and there are 4 options. So that is how these differ from the previous conversation items that appeared in the Ecpe. This particular one is testing rhetorical function. Why does the woman mention her job? She's mentioning her job because she wants to explain her preference for a task. She's implying that she doesn't really want to do something in this volunteer activity that will require her to spend a lot of time talking to people because she already has to do that so much, as she says, at her job during the day. Okay, listening part 2 has also changed. Like I said, this is one of the sections that has changed to make ECCE and ECPE a bit more similar. So now we will have monologues in ECPE. They may be a bit longer than the ones that you see in ECCE, which is of course representative of the C2 nature of the test as opposed to the B2 nature of the ECCE. You will see 6 questions per monologue instead of the 5 that are going to appear in the ECCE. And on this test, these talks are only played once. Because this is a test targeting C2, we felt that that was appropriate. Whereas on the B2 level test, it was the hardest listening task, so we felt like it was the one that should be played twice. But on this test, there is an even longer listening task, so that is the one that will have the double play audio. There is preview time to look at the questions printed in the test booklet before the talk is played. And those questions are both printed in the test booklet and are on the recording. There are 3 of these sets on the ECPE. There are 4 on ECCE, but there will be 3 on this test. And the questions that accompany them can be global, local, or inferential. They may also contain replay items like the ones on the ECCE do. If they do contain a replay item, that item will always be in the final position. Listening part 3. This is the same task as before. This is the task where there is someone or some people, sometimes it's one expert, sometimes it's 2, being interviewed on a radio program. So you will always hear at least 3, sometimes 4 speakers. There's always an anchor in the first position who briefly introduces the topic and the reporter. Then there is the reporter who goes into a bit more detail about what the topic is and introduces the expert or experts. And then the experts actually deliver the bulk of the stimulus, because they are the ones talking about the research study or the event or whatever it is that is the topic of the discussion. They are the ones that have most of the information about it. So that is the voice or the voices that have the longest parts. But one thing you may notice that is slightly different about some of these going forward is that you may notice that there is more back and forth within the interview between the reporter and the expert or experts. We felt that that was more natural to have more of a conversational style in places. In the past, they had been a bit rigid in their structure. So you may notice that there's a bit more of the reporter interjecting or asking more questions and breaking up the delivery of the experts a bit. I do want to assure you, though, we have not made these sets longer. The total length of the interviews is the same. When we write them, we stick to the same word count limits that we used before. It's just we wanted them to sound more natural, so that's why you may hear the reporter raising a question more often or commenting on what the expert is saying between more expert turns. So I hope that makes sense. I just wanted to reassure you that hopefully they'll come across as more natural sounding, but they're not longer, so they're really not any more difficult. We actually hope that this will make them more approachable. There are now 2 sets in this section instead of 3. Each one has 6 questions. Again, same sorts of sub-skills are tested: local, inferential, or global. These sets do not contain replay items like the monologues may. The questions are printed in the test booklet and recorded on audio. These still have 3 options. These have always had 3 options, and they will continue to have 3 answer options with each question. Okay, on to Gcbr. It's now considerably shorter than before. Before there were 120 questions in this section and it was 75 minutes. Now there are 70 questions with 55 minutes to complete the section. In grammar, the number of items is less than half. But again, like ECCE, the specifications for the items themselves have not changed. These are the same grammar items that we have been developing for ECPE for years. Same length, same tested grammatical features, etc. Close sets. There are still 2 closed passages as before with 10 deletions in each. The length of the passages has not changed. The deletions can test grammar, vocabulary, or discourse. The deletions can be single words or they can be multi-word chunks. You may notice that in some closed sets, there may be more multi-word chunks than you have noticed before. We've always allowed multi-word chunks. It's just we would like more variety in what we test in close. We already test vocabulary and grammar in their own sections. There was sometimes some overlap between the vocabulary tested in close and the vocabulary tested in the vocabulary section, and we are trying to avoid that. Multi-word options and deleted chunks make overlap between close and vocabulary section less of an issue. In vocabulary, the number of items has been reduced from 40 to 16, but like the grammar section, the specifications for the items themselves remain the same. The length of the sentences is the same, the parts of speech tested are the same, etc. Reading. The number of items per set has increased from 5 to 6. So before there were always 5 questions with a passage, now you will see 6 questions with a passage. And there is no change in the speaking section. And again, here's a quick overview of the test as a whole. You want to take any notes? Okay, we'd like to give you this chance to ask us questions. So you're welcome to leave a question in Zoom using the Q&A tool in the menu at the bottom of your screen. Like I said, if you have questions about ECPE writing, please hold on to those until next week. I will not be answering questions about ECPE writing today. Please join my colleague Sharon Pierce next week. Her webinar is entitled Unpacking the New ECPE Writing Section. It will be offered at the same time as today's. We know that time doesn't work for everyone, so we do plan to both record the session and make it available later. And we may also be running these sessions again in a few weeks to better accommodate different time zones as well. I also just want to remind you of our info@michiganassessment.org email address. We always welcome your inquiries at that address. You may not have a question right now, but you may leave this webinar and realize, oh, I don't know about this. I should ask. So please use that email address and send us anything that may occur to you over the next few days, weeks, months. We still have several months until these tests are actually rolled out to test takers. So there's a lot of time for questions to be raised before the tests actually go live. I do want to remind you too, we do have sample tests on our website. If you go to michiganassessment.org, there is a section that will take you to information about the revised versions of this test, and it includes a full-length sample test of each of the, for each of the tests. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and start entertaining some questions. My colleague, Renee, is going to be, she has been monitoring the Q&A and will be bringing some of these questions to me now.
Thank you, Rochelle. Hi, everyone. So we have a lot of questions and they're still coming in, so I'm trying to keep up with them. But if we don't get to them, like Rochelle said, we can, if you send an email to Michigan Assessment, we can respond to them later. And if you have questions about ECPE reading or writing, sorry, they could be addressed in the webinar next week. So Rochelle, our first question is about the listening section of the ECCE.
Yes.
And will the questions be played twice or just the stimulus played twice?
It's just the stimulus that is played twice for the monologue. They, the test takers, first you hear the narrator. The narrator says something to the effect of, I don't remember the exact words, so please don't quote me on this. I would have to actually look at the sample test, but something to the effect of, look at the questions. And then there's the preview time, which is several seconds. And then the narrator jumps in again and says, listen to a talk, and then give some information about the setting or the topic or so on. You know, so listen to a tour guide talking to a tour group, for example, could be one of those scene setters. Then the test takers will hear the talk. Then then there will be the narrator again saying, listen to the talk again. And then the talk is played again. And then it moves on to the recordings of the questions.
Okay, thank you. And another question, has the marking criteria changed for the ECCE and ECPE writing sections?
The ECCE writing section, no, the same rating scale will be used. The ECPE writing section, however, does have a new rating scale, and that is something that Sharon Pierce will be talking about next week. So, and also there is more information about ECPE writing available in the section of the website that I just mentioned that has all the sample materials.
Okay, and let's see, so another question, are the questions and possible answers listed on the ECCE test, or are just the answers there?
I'm sorry, could you clarify what is meant? Do you mean if
the question stems printed?
Oh, in the listening section?
Yes, for the ECCE, it looks like they're asking about.
So the ECCE listening part 1 is the picture listening, and those stems, those questions have never been printed in the test booklet, and they will not begin to be printed in the test booklet, but they were not there in the first place. The answer options are simply just the 3 pictures, and the stem is only heard on the audio. The questions for ECCE listening part 2 are printed in the test booklet.
Okay, let's see. A couple questions. Will there be new practice books that reflect the revised exams?
I am going to turn on my camera at the request of some people. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again, Renee?
Yes, of course. Will new practice books that reflect the revised exams be available?
Eventually, that is our hope. I know that we have already produced sample tests that are available on our website, but several publishing companies are already working hard on producing their own test preparation materials. We also have an educational materials department, and our colleagues in that department are working on materials for these tests as well.
Okay. One quick question that just came up. Will the ECCE replace MET Go in the future?
I mean, MET Go will continue to be MET Go. Whether or not a test center or an organization that recognizes scores or a language school wants to use the tests differently in the future is their prerogative, but we will continue to develop both tests.
Okay. For the Ecpe Part 2 listening replay item, can the replay be taken from anywhere in the monologue, including the beginning of it?
Sure. Could be anywhere.
And this is also a listening question. Will the candidates have time at the end of the listening section to transfer their answers?
No. As previously, as we have always done previously, we expect the test takers to mark the answer on the separate answer sheet, not in their test booklet. That instruction is given by the administrator and also on the recording.
Okay. And for the writing section, and I'm not sure if this was in reference to ECCE or Ecpe, are test takers required to write a title for the article?
No.
Okay. And for the speaking test, are the speaking sections videotaped?
That they are recorded. They are not necessarily videotaped. I think in the past we have only required audio recordings. We do require the recordings in case, well, we monitor the scoring of the speaking tests, and also in case there are ever any reasons to have to check the score. That's why we have the recordings done.
Okay. Let's see. There's a lot more questions coming in.
I can see some of them now. I see that there are some coming in the chat and some coming in the Q&A. So I do apologize, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, because of the huge number of attendees, it's going to be impossible to answer every single question, but I'm seeing that we have literally hundreds of questions. So yes. Okay.
So for Ecpe Part 1, can it have 3 speakers?
Yes, so that is one thing that is a bit different. There are a few differences, as I mentioned, between the conversational listening items on the Ecpe that exists now and that is still going to be given through December, and then the one for next year. It's certainly not all of the items. It's, maybe a handful. There is not a fixed number on any single test that has to have 2 or 3 speakers. I will say that the majority of listening conversations in Ecpe Part 1 will continue to have 2 speakers. There will be at least one, probably, with 3 speakers, but it's certainly not going to be most of them. It will be a few of them. We just felt like that gave us more opportunities to test the sub skills, and it was just more natural. I mean, a lot of conversations happen in settings with more than 2 people. There are the discussions that happen in Part 3 of the listening test on Ecpe, but those are formal. Those are radio interviews. Those aren't conversations that happen, at the water cooler in your office, or, classmates working on a project together, or friends hanging out at a restaurant. So we wanted to be able to have the flexibility to present those sorts of situations that weren't all simply 2 people. We just felt it was more natural to include some that included a 3rd speaker.
Okay. And here's a question I can probably answer quickly.
Okay.
For ECCE, in the email letter task in the writing section, will the candidate always be asked to provide a single suggestion, like where to go, or some suggestions, like how to do something, or does it depend on the topic? It's exactly that. It depends on the topic. So they may be asked to provide one suggestion with multiple supporting details and develop it in that way, or they may be asked to give more than one suggestion and to develop each of those. Let's see.
Thank you for answering that, Renee.
Of course. And let's see, there's a lot of questions about what the passing score is. Rochelle, I don't know if you have any insight on that.
There haven't been changes to the scoring.
Okay.
So.
Let's see. I'm trying to find one more question that we can answer in the last couple minutes. So here's another ECCE writing question for task 1. Will there be an email suggesting an event or an email to somebody other than city councils or teachers, for example, an association? And the answer to that is yes. We expect that there will be kind of an expanded group of people that the test takers might be asked to write a letter or email to. Let's see. Will the ECCE start with the writing part? Yes.
Right. That is one of the things that has been made consistent across the 2 tests.
Let's see. Somebody asked about if any printed material is coming soon.
Like I said, many publishers are already working on their own printed materials, and our educational materials department is also developing more materials for these tests. I'm not sure how many of them will be digital on a website versus a hard copy book, but there is a lot of work going into those materials.
Okay, well, we might have time for one more question. In the reference to the multi-word chunks now allowed in the closed section, how does that differ from the vocabulary section?
There are some multi-word chunks in the ECPE vocabulary section. For example, we may test a phrasal verb or a fixed idiom. Those may also appear in close. They've always been allowed in close. But what we're getting at when we test multi-word chunks in close is more about both intra and intersentential discourse. So when we're doing that in a vocabulary item, you're only working within that one sentence, which is very short. It's not an entire paragraph of text or, you know, a several, like the number of words that appear in a closed passage far exceeds the number of words that appear in a discrete vocabulary item. So when a chunk of text is removed from a closed passage, it may require the test taker to read beyond that clause in which the chunk was removed. So they will most certainly have to read the entirety of the sentence, but in many cases, they will have to read beyond that sentence. There may be information that precedes or follows that deletion that makes the different options keyable or not. Within that chunk, all of those options may appear correct, but if they read to the next sentence or 2 sentences later, then there may be some information that renders one of those answers correct and the other 3 incorrect. We can't do that in a discrete vocabulary item because it's so short.
Thank you. There are some more questions, but we
are about out of time. We are already over time by a minute, but I did see a couple of questions on the side about, you know, are there going to be additional presentations, seminars, so on. We're going to continue to do as much as we can. We will hold, you know, additional webinars and produce more materials. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we are not able to send our staff around the world as we used to. I know that many of you have met some of my colleagues, Sharon Pierce, Barbara Dobson, Gad Lim, and so on, who have gone to your centers, be they in Europe or South America or even Asia, and presented. Unfortunately, we can't do any of that right now, but we are going to continue to do as much as we can virtually. to support you and hope to spread the word about what has and has not changed with these tests. Okay, well, since it's already 10:02, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. But I did also see many comments about sample tests, please. They are already available. Many of the things that people seem to be asking for in the chat can be found on our website. So I urge you to go to our website and look at the materials that are available for the new ECC and ECPE. You can download the zip files of the materials, and they're a great starting point for preparing for these new versions of the tests.